Howdy doody folks, and welcome back to my journey across the United States, where every state has a story, and South Carolina, you might just have some of the strangest stories in the whole USA. Whether it be another near-nuclear disaster in the Carolinas, what's going on with your nukes, or a strange story of police officers having a run-in with someone that's all too akin to Spock, your lore is on point in South Carolina, and you clearly don't do boring. Now, before we jump in, a quick favor to ask: if you enjoy these deep dives into America's strangest tales, dropping a comment and a like and hitting that subscribe button like it just called your mama fat helps me out more than anything as I struggle my way up this hill towards 100,000 subscribers in 2025. This will never cost you a dime, and it's a quick way to say, hey YouTube, this guy's alright. Anyways, with that, let's get into the video. Now, in my video on North Carolina, I covered their little near-nuclear oopsie, where a plane carrying 2 nukes, as part of a mission named Coverall, decided to spring a fuel leak and take an unscheduled nosedive into Goldsboro. At the time, I didn't exactly stop and think, this must be a Carolina thing. But now, after reading up on South Carolina's own brush with an accidental atomic firework, I'm starting to wonder. Anyways, this story begins on March 11th of 1958, when a Boeing B-47 Stratojet took off from Hunter Air Force Base in Savannah, Georgia at 4:34 p.m. Its destination, the United Kingdom and North Africa, as part of something called Operation Snow Flurry, a mission where B-47s were flying back and forth between South Carolina and England, pretending to drop bombs to see how good they were at it. Now, in case of an actual war breaking out mid-flight, these planes carried live bombs, but only ones packed with 2 tons of regular explosives, not nukes. The actual nuclear cores were safely removed and kept in a compartment charmingly named the birdcage, because when dealing with weapons of mass destruction, it's important to stay kawaii. Now, on this particular day, about 25 minutes after takeoff, Captain Bruce Kolka, the navigator, was called to the bomb bay, when Captain Earl Kohler, the pilot, noticed a warning light saying, "Hey, your bomb harness pin didn't lock." So anyways, Kolka, being a responsible guy, went to check on it. Here, his job was simple, you'd think. All he had to do was insert a steel pin through the shackle on the warhead to prevent an accidental drop. What did he actually do, though? He somehow unhooked the entire warhead, and since this thing wasn't exactly a paperweight, it promptly crashed onto the bomb bay doors, which shockingly were not built to hold a 7,600-pound explosive, and suddenly crashed through them. The doors gave way, and the bomb took a free-fall plunge from 15,000 feet. Kolka, to his credit, did not follow, which is lucky because Kolka was not in fact a bird. Moments later, the pilots heard a rumble and the co-pilot saw a shockwave hit the ground, at which point they made the only reasonable decision available: abort the mission. Now, like I said, the warhead didn't have its nuclear core in it, so no mushroom cloud today. However, it did contain enough conventional explosives to piss in the proverbial Cheerios of the people below, which was particularly unfortunate for one Walter Gregg, a World War II veteran who just so happened to have his home in the bomb's landing zone. Gregg was working in his garage at the time, and just 100 meters away, his wife Effie was inside of their house, while their children and niece played outside. In an instant, the explosion tore through the property, ripping off the garage's walls, caving in the house's roof, and sending debris everywhere. According to Gregg, trees were knocked over, smoke filled the air, and overall it sounded like an artillery shell had just gone off in his backyard because, well, it kind of had. Now, despite all of this, miraculously nobody died. Walter Gregg got a deep cut on his arm, Effie took a hit from some falling plaster, and the kids were banged up by debris, though one did need surgery for internal injuries. Unfortunately, the same couldn't be said for the 12 hens on the property, who were, let's just say, permanently retired from service. Colonel Sanders would not have approved. Now, there was a little bit of uranium in the bomb, but experts determined the contamination levels were low enough that a good rinse would do the trick. The military's reputation, on the other hand, wasn't so easily scrubbed clean. The press had a field day, with both domestic and international outlets suddenly questioning whether the US maybe, just maybe, wasn't handling its nuclear arsenal with the kind of care one might hope for. To be fair, this was already the 13th major incident involving an American nuclear weapon, and just a few weeks earlier another bomb had been jettisoned over Georgia, because apparently dropping nukes was just part of the weekly routine back then. As for the Gregg family, they were at least compensated for their totally unnecessary near-death experience, receiving the modern equivalent of about $570,000, meaning the crew of the B-47 got disciplined in the most Cold War way possible, by being immediately reassigned overseas. They did, however, send the Greggs some heartfelt letters of apology, which is almost the same as not dropping a bomb on their house in the first place, right? At the very least, this fiasco led to some actual safety improvements, like, say, securing nuclear weapons properly while in flight. And in 2008, a historical marker was placed by the Florence City and County Historical Society to commemorate this whole debacle. If you're ever in the area, you can even visit the Florence County Museum, where they still have fragments of the bomb on display. Because really, what says local history quite like a giant hole where the Air Force accidentally tested explosives on a guy's backyard? And speaking of the giant hole, the impact site itself, now known as the Mars Bluff Crater, is still there. It's not quite as dramatic as something you'd find on the actual Mars, but it's a lasting reminder that, yes, the US once accidentally dropped a bomb on a random South Carolina family. You can visit this site today, where a small path leads to the crater, now mostly reclaimed by nature, but still visible as a dent in the landscape. It's a bizarre little piece of history, a place where you can stand and reflect on the fact that at one point, the US airmen screwed up and had to write the most awkward apology letter in military history. Okay, so let's set the mood. We're kicking off this video with some good old-fashioned, spooky urban legends. You know, the kind that makes you double-check that your doors are locked and maybe sleep with one eye open. And from my research, one of the most infamous of these legends in South Carolina is the Boo Hag. Now, before we get into exactly what a Boo Hag is, we need to talk about the Gullah people and their culture. The Gullah are an African-American ethnic group residing in the coastal regions and sea islands of South Carolina, Georgia, and parts of Florida. Their ancestry traces back to the enslaved West and Central Africans brought over due to their expertise in rice cultivation, a skill that was unfortunately exploited in the low country economies of the Carolinas and Georgia. Because the enslaved people were often isolated and in island communities, their culture developed into a unique blend of African traditions and regional influences, resulting in distinct folklore, language, and customs. And while none of us are exactly thrilled about the conditions that led to this cultural preservation, the folklore that emerged is undeniably fascinating. Among these tales, the absolutely nightmare-fuel creature known as the Boo Hag. In Gullah lore, the Boo Hag looks like a normal person during the day, but there's a terrible reason for that. See, in classic Skinwalker fashion, the Boo Hag doesn't have its own skin. Instead, it wears the skin of its last victim, like a very morbid, very illegal Halloween costume. At night, however, it sheds this disguise, revealing its true form, a skinless creature with exposed red muscles, visible blue veins, glowing eyes, and to complete the look, long white hair. Sorta sounds like the kind of thing I'd regret Googling at 2 a.m. Heck, I do regret Googling it at 10:49 a.m. But the Boo Hag isn't just scary to look at. It also has a nasty habit of sneaking into people's homes, and I mean sneaking. A fully locked and sealed house doesn't matter. The Boo Hag can slip in through the tiniest crack, a crevice, even the chimney. And once inside, it'll crawl on top of you while you sleep and, get this, literally suck the air from your lungs. The Gullah even have a saying about it: "Don't let the hag ride ya," which has some unfortunate phrasing, but let's keep it PG here. Anyways, most people don't wake up when this happens. Instead, they just feel completely drained the next morning, as if they'd pulled an all-nighter despite being in bed for 8 hours. But if you do wake up, congratulations, you're about to become the Boo Hag's next outfit on Project Runway, because the last thing it wants is a witness, so it'll end you and steal your skin for its next disguise. Now, let's just say you live in the coastal Carolinas and lately you've been waking up exhausted. Maybe, just maybe, a Boo Hag is paying you a visit. But don't panic, there are ways to defend yourself. First off, leaving a broom by your bed at night might buy you some time. Why? Because the Boo Hag apparently has obsessive-compulsive tendencies when it comes to numbers, and it will be compelled to count every single bristle on the broom before attacking you. Second, the color blue is said to ward off spirits, so painting your room or bed frame blue might help. You'll even sometimes see blue bottles hanging from trees in the area, and this looks like decor, but it's actually a nod to this superstition, as well as the Gullah's history, since many of their ancestors worked on indigo plantations. West African traditions also associate indigo dye with protection and spiritual power, so the symbolism runs deep. Now, if you're still worried about the Boo Hag, you can step it up a notch. A well-placed ring of salt or cayenne pepper around your bed should keep the Boo Hag out entirely. And if you really want to take one down, just leave out a pile of rice, salt, or sand by a window. Like the broom, the Boo Hag won't be able to resist counting every grain. And if it's still counting when the sun comes up, well, let's just say it's not a morning person, and it might get dissolved by the sunlight. So to sum it up, the Boo Hag is basically a vampiric spirit from Gullah Folklore that doesn't drink blood but instead steals your life force via your breath, and occasionally your skin. Most people write it off as pure legend, but some folks take it very seriously. If you or someone you know has had a run-in with one of these creatures, I'd love to hear about it. Drop your story in the comments, or sleep with a pile of sand next to your bed just in case. The Gaffney Incident is one of those UFO stories that's just bizarre enough to make you say, wow, credible people just reported an encounter with extraterrestrial life. But sadly, like many of these cases, there are few, if any, details to back up the story. Regardless, let's get into it. Our story begins on November 16th of 1966 with a massive meteor shower lighting up the night sky over the United States. So already, we've got a whole lot of things flying around up there. The next day, in the small town of Gaffney, South Carolina, best known for being the peach capital of the state, things got weird. Before we even get to Gaffney, it's worth noting other strange sightings were already happening that night. In Quarryville, Pennsylvania, 2 women claimed they saw a white and green object in the sky. Then 2 nights later, in Michigan, a similar object was spotted, suspiciously coinciding with power outages. So naturally, when 2 police officers in Gaffney, Officer Charles Hutchins and Officer Husky, encountered something unusual on the road, it didn't seem entirely out of nowhere. According to the officers, they spotted a metallic object in front of them, hovering about 20 feet above the ground. It was described as a dull gold-colored sphere with a rim around it. No flashy lights or portholes, just a weird ball metal thing hanging out in the sky. Then things escalated. A door opened, a ladder dropped, and out stepped a figure. Here's where the rumors around town started spreading. Supposedly, these officers met a strange man who stepped out of a flying saucer. The encounter was reported in the newspaper and even made it into Fate magazine, which is basically a print version of the late-night conspiracy YouTube you might be watching. Anyways, enter John Keel, a well-known paranormal researcher and author. He tracked down Officer Hutchins, who was initially reluctant to talk because other officers had been ridiculed for discussing these sorts of events, but Keel gained his trust, and Hutchins finally told his version of events, to expand upon what was reported in a newspaper at an earlier date. According to Hutchins, the figure they saw wasn't some stereotypical little green man, though amusingly, reporters had apparently pressured them into saying that it was. Instead, Hutchins described the being that they saw as almost human, but still just off. It was about 4 feet tall, roughly the size of a 12-year-old, and wore a shiny gold suit. Oddly enough, Hutchins couldn't recall seeing its feet, which, let's be honest, is a pretty major detail to forget when recounting your meeting with a possible extraterrestrial being. Despite its unsettling appearance, the being didn't seem afraid of the officers, and it walked right up to them. Then it started talking. A lot. But apparently, despite speaking like a college graduate, that was a quote by them, and in perfect English with no accent, it didn't actually answer any of their questions. Instead, it asked them questions, like why the 2 officers wore matching outfits. Now, after Hutchins explained that they were police officers, he would ask the creature where it was from, and the being just kinda laughed at them, which honestly is exactly how I'd handle it if I were an alien trying to mess with some human cops. After a few minutes of this bizarre Q&A session, the being casually announced that it would return in 2 days. Then it turned around, walked into its craft, and after a bit of whirring, zipped off into the night sky. Naturally, Hutchins and Husky were a little shaken. The next day, they returned to the site with a local councilman where they reportedly found small footprints similar to those of a child. Keel later judged Hutchins as an honest guy with a good reputation, and Husky, who had since left the force to run his own business, confirmed the story over the phone, adding that he wished he could forget the whole thing. Neither officer supposedly had ever read any UFO literature, though verifying that claim is about as easy as proving the existence of a little golden spaceman, to be honest. Now, also, about that promised return visit in 2 days. Hutchins and Husky would faithfully return to the site every night for 2 weeks. The result of this? It was nothing. Well, almost nothing. One night they did see a strange orange ball of light sailing overhead, but that was it. As Hutchins later joked, "We don't know how long his days are." Fair point, I guess. So what really happened that night? Well, some folks think the officers saw a military test craft. Others blame swamp gas or some unexplained atmospheric phenomenon, but no solid explanation was ever put forward. And the little man in the golden suit, he never did come back, at least not in a way we know about. Maybe he's still out there somewhere, laughing at our fashion choices in space. Anyways, that's the Gaffney UFO encounter. Let me know if you believe this one in the comments, or if it smells of extraterrestrial BS. If you're familiar with the risks of various natural disasters, which, as a nerd, I sort of am, you'll know that South Carolina ranks among the top 5 states most impacted by hurricanes. These days, while these storms still cause significant property damage, people at least receive several days' warning, allowing them to evacuate and move inland. But before meteorologists had the ability to track storms using satellites and computer models, South Carolina had a different method for predicting hurricanes, or at least Pawleys Island did. His name was, and perhaps still is, the Gray Man. As the legend goes, if you ever feel a strong breeze and hear a whisper urging you to move inland, you may have encountered the Gray Man. This ghostly figure has been reported appearing on the beaches of Pawleys Island before every major hurricane since the Great Hurricane of 1893. Witnesses describe him, unsurprisingly, as a gray, translucent figure who vanishes into thin air as they approach. Now I know, I don't usually cover ghosts in these weird folklore videos, but given this dude is a one-man meteorological forecast, I think he's better identified as a technology, in my humble opinion. Now, one possible origin of this spectral warning comes from Plowden C.J. Weston, a wealthy plantation owner and politician who once lived on Pawleys Island. Also, by politician, I literally mean he was the governor of the state from 1862 to his passing. Weston's family owned Hagley Plantation, and on the coastal portion of their estate, they built the Pelican Inn. Plowden, known for his signature gray clothing, received the plantation as a wedding gift. Now that's a heck of a wedding gift, and became one of the wealthiest men in the state. On his estate, he and his wife, Emily Esdale, whom he met while studying in England, adored their island home. And the Pelican Inn was built from boards milled at Hagley Plantation. They'd lived here from 1847 when they got married until 1864, when Plowden would pass away from tuberculosis, at which point he was laid to rest. But according to the legend, he didn't stay at rest. Shortly after his death, sightings of the Gray Man began, and as the story goes, they still continue to this day. Because of this, if you see a gray translucent man anywhere on Pawleys Island, don't get scared of the ghost, get scared of what lies beyond the sea. And maybe check that weather app on your phone, because if the legend holds true, a storm is coming. In Columbia, South Carolina, there are a pair of urban legends that I'm going to talk about. The first of which is an urban legend of tunnels underneath Columbia, which isn't really an urban legend at all, actually, though there are urban legend elements. Now, if you take a stroll through the forums of the world or iterate with some locals, you might quickly stumble upon the claim that underneath Columbia there is an interwoven network of brick-lined tunnels that weren't built alongside the city. No, rather they were built far later, during the Civil War. These rumors claim that the primary purpose of these tunnels was so that in the event of a northern invasion of Columbia, Confederate forces could easily flee to safety to the nearby Tombigbee River, where they could make an escape. Others even claim this network of tunnels was built so that the wounded soldiers could be more easily transported to the nearby river, or perhaps at least be hidden from the eyes of those uneasy soldiers who didn't want to see their fallen compatriots. Now, in terms of whether these tunnels really exist under Columbia, to be clear, they absolutely do. There are 100% tunnels all over the city, with those best known existing under the University of South Carolina's campus, and some also dwelling underneath the Gilmer Hotel and the S.D. Lee home, with these subterranean tunnels totaling about 16 miles in length. Additionally, here and there, tunnel entrances are discovered upon cave-ins or fires that occasionally expose the ground resting below. There are also well-known segments of these tunnels that open up to the river. In particular, one at Riverfront Park that's dark recesses lead towards the city of Columbia. So with the existence of these tunnels established, I beg the question, are these tunnels running below Columbia Civil War tunnels? Well, sadly, I hate to burst the bubble of yet another urban legend, but not quite. I'm sure that throughout the years of the Civil War, there were wartime applications for these tunnels, and this does make for a nice story, but in reality, these tunnels are speculated to have been built by the city in the mid-1800s, being completed after the end of the Civil War, with their original intention being that of a brick storm drainage system. Also, under the University of South Carolina, those tunnels are well known to be utility tunnels that are only legally accessible to maintenance staff. In regards to the drainage tunnels, though, over time it's thought the location of these tunnels was forgotten, not because they were originally intended to be secret, but because they were gradually left off of drainage maps. This might sound fishy, but it's actually a fairly common occurrence that cities will forget where they put things over time. Just ask any urban planner or utility worker in Boston if they've ever found an unmarked natural gas pipeline. In short, you'll find time and time again that if your goal is to hide something, incompetence is a greater concealer than human intent could ever hope to be. And in the case of Columbia, South Carolina, incompetence and likely poor documentation has led to the location of many of these old drainage tunnels to be an enigma. This being said, if you have a sense that something peculiar might be going on in these drainage tunnels or the utility tunnels under the University of South Carolina, you might just be onto something. See, it's said that someone or something may be dwelling in them, and that brings us to our next topic. The story of the Third Eye Man is interesting. I can't really tell if it's a tale of a human, a cryptid, a ghost, or something otherworldly, but regardless, while my alma mater Tennessee plays host to the Wampus Cat as its home field cryptid, the University of South Carolina's home cryptid is the Third Eye Man. The story of this strange man starts on November 12th of 1949 when on the campus of the University of South Carolina, a man was seen opening a manhole cover on the corner of Sumner and Green Streets, just across from the Long Street Theater at 10:43 p.m. This man was not dressed typically. His outfit was a bright silver color, and according to the witnesses, he would hop into the sewer and replace the cover as if nothing ever happened. Some sources claim that the students on this evening claimed the man had a third eye, and others don't. And admittedly, me and other YouTubers have had trouble finding an original copy of this article to reference and make sure. One of these students conveniently was part of the school newspaper, his name being Christopher Nichols, a freshman I think that was part of the class of 1953, and he would write an article about this guy calling him the Sewer Man. Briefly, this would cause a stir on campus, but no further sightings would happen anytime soon, and after a few weeks the hubbub around this so-called Sewer Man would dissipate. That is until April 7th of 1950, when the so-called Sewer Man would once again make an appearance. This episode was actually observed by what is perhaps a more reliable source than a freshman in college at 10:43 p.m., a university police officer. This officer would come across mutilated chickens behind the Long Street Theater, again near the scene of the first crime. This mutilation entailed feathers and chickens' body parts being scattered all over the loading dock of this theater. Of course, when you see a mess on a college campus in the SEC, you rightfully should assume that frat boys are the culprit, and this officer did just that. But when he returned to the loading dock to start clearing the mess he found, he would see a man dressed in silver, or perhaps that might have been silver, and he was huddled around the chicken parts. He would shine his flashlight on this man, likely shocked, but when the light hit the man and the face would turn to look at the police officer, a very strange and very specific feature would make itself clear. The man on his forehead would have another eye. The description apparently specifies that this was not a large eye, which I think is funny, but regardless, apparently it was a small eye on his forehead. This supposedly caused the officer to leave the scene. Maybe he thought the man was about to start shooting laser beams at him or something. But of course, when he returned with backup, there was nothing left but feathers and chicken bones. From reports I'm reading, the officer never lived this one down. Finally, there was a third sighting of this supposed Third Eye Man, this one happening in the 1960s. In this episode, students in October of this year would actually enter the tunnels that the Third Eye Man was previously seen retreating to, bringing pledges down there as a sort of hazing ritual. They would enter the tunnels on this night from Gambrill Hall, which today hosts the University of South Carolina's Department of History, and headed down towards the University Horseshoe, the name for the U-shaped original campus that was called South Carolina College. The thing is, though, this hazing ritual would go south really fast. Upon turning their first corner, they would stumble upon a man that looked, I quote, crippled, who was dressed in all silver. He suddenly, though, would do the least crippled person thing ever, and he would charge at the boys rapidly with a lead pipe, knocking one of the pledges, one Matthew Tabor, over and cutting him and scaring him. Funny enough, this event would lead to a so-called third eye manhunt, where police would search the tunnels of the university for hours, though they found nothing. After this event, the university would more closely guard their tunnels, sealing off most of the entrances and making them off-limits to most people that were not maintenance staff or authorities. Now it's worth noting, while these stories are generally more of the same from here on out, the Third Eye Man continued to be spotted into the 90s, though most of these sightings have been laughed off as fictional by university police. That being said, maintenance staff still report a feeling of unease when they enter the tunnels, and to this day, access to them is restricted because of the events that took place during this so-called Third Eye Man saga. If you've ever looked into the origins of the Civil War, you already know it's a tangled mess of political drama, clashing economic systems, and just a whole lot of bad blood. But if you had to pick one event that really screams, yeah, this country is about to throw hands, you'd be hard-pressed to find a better example than the 1856 caning of Senator Charles Sumner by Representative Preston Brooks. This was not just a casual disagreement, it was a full-on beatdown on the U.S. Senate floor that made it abundantly clear that the North and South were not just bickering but actively spiraling towards war. Now, to be fair, this didn't happen in South Carolina, but given that Brooks hailed from there, the state still managed to find itself smack in the middle of the national discourse, mostly because its politicians were out here treating Congress like an 1850s fight club. So let's set the stage. In 1856, the country was already on edge over the whole Bleeding Kansas situation, and Sumner, a hardcore abolitionist from Massachusetts, decided to throw some gasoline on the fire. Over 2 days, because apparently one day of roastings wasn't enough, he delivered a speech titled The Crime Against Kansas, in which he shredded pro-slavery politicians, mocked the slave power, and essentially compared the expansion of slavery to a violent assault on the country. And then, because he was absolutely not in the business of making friends, he took a specific aim at Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina. Not only did he slam Butler's pro-slavery stance, but he also went full playground insult mode, comparing Butler's devotion to slavery to an infatuation with a harlot, and even mocking the senator's speech impediment, which had resulted from a stroke. This did not sit well with Representative Preston Brooks, who also happened to be Butler's cousin. Brooks was so enraged that he initially considered challenging Sumner to a duel, because apparently this was just a normal Tuesday for politicians back then. But after some deliberation with fellow South Carolina Congressman Lawrence M. Keitt, they decided that Sumner wasn't even worthy of a duel because, get this, dueling was reserved for honorable men. Instead, Brooks landed on the far more reasonable approach of sneak attacking Sumner and beating him senseless in public. So on May 22nd of 1856, Brooks strolled into the Senate chamber, bringing along his backup dancers, Keitt and Virginia Representative Henry A. Edmondson. He waited for the room to clear, making sure no women were present because that would have been uncivilized apparently to do this in front of women, and then walked straight up to Sumner's desk. In a calm, almost casual tone, Brooks said, "Mr. Sumner, I have read your speech twice over carefully. It is libel on South Carolina and Mr. Butler, who is a relative of mine." Sumner barely had any time to process what was happening before Brooks absolutely wrecked him with a wooden cane. The first blow was so hard that Sumner temporarily lost his vision. Trapped under his desk, he couldn't even defend himself, as Brooks continued swinging his cane. Even when Sumner managed to break free and try to run, Brooks chased him down, whacking him over the head, face, and shoulders relentlessly. He hit him so many times that his cane literally broke in half, yet he kept on going. Meanwhile, attempts to stop the assault were not very successful. Keitt actually pulled a pistol out and threatened anyone who tried to intervene because apparently this was a tag team event. It wasn't until Representative Ambrose S. Murray and Edwin B. Morgan physically restrained Brooks that he finally stopped, at which point he calmly walked out of the chamber like he hadn't just committed aggravated assault in a government building. Sumner, unconscious and bleeding, was eventually patched up and made it back to his lodging, but he was not okay. This attack left him so badly injured that he wouldn't be able to resume his Senate duties for 3 years. The North saw this as undeniable proof that the South couldn't even tolerate free speech anymore, turning Sumner into a martyr. Meanwhile, the South, well, they basically loved it. Southern newspapers praised Brooks, with the Richmond Enquirer, for instance, saying Sumner should be caned every morning. Southerners started sending Brooks new canes, too, as a sign of support, because apparently his cane-breaking beatdowns were now a cherished pastime for the country. In the aftermath, Brooks challenged and was challenged to multiple duels, none of which actually came to fruition, but he also made it clear he was very open to beating other senators on the floor if necessary. Sumner, on the other hand, was mocked by the South for supposedly exaggerating his injuries, even though he suffered from them for the rest of his life. Despite everything, Sumner was re-elected in 1857, and even though he couldn't physically return to the Senate until 1859, his political career survived the attack. The same couldn't be said for the unity of the country, though. The attack fueled sympathy for the Republican Party and further solidified the perception that pro-slavery Democrats were a bunch of violent extremists. By the time Lincoln won the presidency in 1860, it was clear. The cracks had become chasms, and the Civil War was all but inevitable. And to think, this was in large part because one guy took an insult very personally and decided that he'd give another elected representative a taste of his mind. If you know this channel, usually you'll know I'm one to cover well-developed stories, things that aren't so recent, or at the very least, stories that have come to their conclusion. But today I'm going to cover a phenomenon that's not so well-developed. For years now, residents and visitors of Myrtle Beach, South Carolina have been witnessing strange occurrences in the night sky, fueling speculation, excitement, and intrigue. While Myrtle Beach is renowned as a popular resort destination on the northern edge of South Carolina, it has also gained a reputation as a hotspot for UFO sightings. These mysterious phenomena range from strange, shifting lights to reports of tangible craft, and many believe the phenomenon has been steadily increasing in frequency. So what's going on here? Well, the most common reports from Myrtle Beach residents and visitors center around the unusual lights in the sky, which appear with little to no warning and behave erratically. The first mention of these lights I could find firsthand in connection with anything otherworldly dates back to 2014, when a Reddit user known as MacMac360 detailed 2 consecutive nights of sightings where he saw red or orange orbs hovering just above the ocean horizon. These lights weren't stationary. According to his accounts, they moved in formation, occasionally even shooting up into the sky and disappearing just as quickly as they appeared. While skeptics might suggest these were simply flashing lights of passing ships, MacMac360 insisted that the objects were much higher, appearing to fly rather than float, and sometimes even rocketing, as I said, into the night sky. Others on Reddit shared similar experiences, describing lights that would appear, seemingly in perfect order, and then disappear in the same sequence. This consistency was unlike typical ship lights or other conventional sources of illumination in the area. That's at least according to them. Let me know if this is the case in the comments. Additionally, as it turns out, these forum users speaking of strange lights in the sky are not alone. Myrtle Beach, and more specifically Horry County, which encompasses Myrtle Beach, has earned a curious distinction. According to the UFO Sightings Desk reference, United States of America 2001 to 2020, published in 2021, Horry County has the highest rate of UFO sightings per capita in the whole United States, averaging 254.1 sightings per 100,000 residents. That's a significant number, though I guess we should question whether or not the source it comes from, the UFO Sightings Desk reference, is reliable. I haven't heard of that one before. Let me know if it's reliable in the comments. Now, I should note that many witnesses believe that the clear, dark skies over the beach combine with the area's coastal setting to make it ideal for spotting unusual activity. That being said, there are plenty of coastal regions with far more people and far more military activity offshore, yet they lack the wide variety of strange offshore occurrences that you might observe off the coast of Myrtle Beach, if you believe the stories, that is. Now, some might laugh this off as coincidence, but many take this abundance of sightings of strange occurrences to suggest that something truly strange is going on here. Also, these sightings aren't just blanket reports of lights. In the case of Myrtle Beach, there are more first-hand accounts of strange aerial phenomenon that I could touch in an hour-long video, but I will give you a few first-hand examples in this realm. To start, in 2013, an individual reported seeing orange lights moving along the water's edge that appeared to hover and pulse, lasting for about 10 to 15 minutes before disappearing. This report was followed by more similar stories, such as in 2014 when witnesses observed multiple lights flickering in and out of sight every few seconds, moving south along the coast. Perhaps one of the most notable reports in the area comes from airline pilots in September of 2013 when they described spotting black triangular UFOs at an altitude of around 19,000 feet. These craft were estimated to be about 500 feet below the planes, and they were the size of cars according to the pilots. The pilots described these shapes as black triangles, adding yet another piece to this unidentified flying puzzle of a mystery. Other reports describe encounters with the classic saucer-shaped UFO, such as in 2015 when witnesses observed these disc-shaped objects moving in ways that echoed the behavior of other lights seen in the area, appearing, disappearing, and even following the observers sometimes. Some witnesses claim the discs seemed to hover at certain points, almost as if they were keeping track of their every movement. In addition to strange lights in the sky, there have also been reports of potential military involvement in the area. For instance, some have suggested that the orange lights may sometimes be connected to offshore maneuvers, possibly the afterburners of military jets. Admittedly, I'll give it to the naysayers here, these lights can look a heck of a lot like the afterburners from jets, and even sometimes like the flares used in nighttime offshore rescue drills. That being said, neither afterburners nor flares, to my knowledge, have ever been known to split into multiple lights, moving rapidly in different directions towards the horizon. So in short, while the impression most have of Myrtle Beach is as a resort town full of tourists eager to enjoy a slice of beachfront life, between the hours of 10 p.m. and 12 a.m. it's said to be imbued with a sense of mystery, suddenly becoming home to fewer margaritas and more strange orange lights that dance through the night sky. For now, these mysterious sightings remain unidentified, yet the growing number of reports and the eerie consistency in their description suggest that Myrtle Beach may indeed be a hotspot for something far beyond the ordinary. Now, you know the drill. If you happen to be in the area and have found yourself observing something strange in the night sky, let me know down below, or even better, send me a picture. I'd love to hear what strange things you've seen off the coast of your beautiful state. So 2 videos ago, in my video on Tennessee's weird folklore, I made what I assumed was an uncontroversial statement, that slave ownership was not a virtuous practice. Seems sort of like a given, right? Well, a few folks, modern-day people, not ghosts from the 1800s, felt the need to inform me that viewing slavery as morally wrong is somehow anachronistic. That, by today's standards, calling out the brutality of owning human beings is akin to getting worked up over people smoking indoors in the 1960s. Now, I understand historical context, I really do. If you were raised in a world where something horrific was normalized, you might not immediately question it. But, and I cannot stress this enough, we don't live in the 1800s anymore, and smoking indoors is currently and will never be viewed in a similar light to treating humans like property. So in the interest of continuing to disappoint these individuals, today I want to highlight the story of one of the most remarkable figures in American history, Robert Smalls, a man born into slavery who not only took back his own freedom, but went on to serve in the Union military and afterwards in Congress, proving with every breath that he was worth 100 times more than the people who claimed to own him. The story of Robert Smalls begins with him being born in Beaufort, South Carolina in 1839, to Lydia Polite, a slave owned by Ashdale plantation owner Henry McKee, who some say was also Smalls' father, with other culprits being Henry McKee's son and the plantation manager Patrick Smalls. Now, whoever his father was, the McKee family was said to favor Smalls over the other slave children, and while his mother Lydia worked in the Ashdale plantation house, she wanted Robert to know the horrors of slavery, so he was sent to the fields to work and witness slave whippings. Smalls, because of this exposure, would grow defiant, and because of this, often acted out, finding himself in the Beaufort jail often. His mother, fearing for his safety and because of his behavior, would ask McGee to rent him out as a laborer in Charleston, and he would do just that. Thus, at 12 years old, Robert was sent to Charleston to be hired out. Smalls had several jobs here, from which he was allowed to keep $1 of his wages per week, with McGee taking the rest. As part of these jobs, though, Smalls would receive a different sort of compensation, in the sense that he would become a skilled navigator, and it's said that after a short while, he knew the Charleston harbor perhaps better than anyone else in the city. In Charleston, Smalls would also meet his future wife, Hannah, who was an enslaved maid at a Charleston hotel, with the two getting married around 1856, and allowed to move in together in an apartment. The couple would have 2 children, Elizabeth and Robert Jr., and Smalls saved money to try and buy the freedom of his new family, but Hannah's owner demanded $800, a large sum for those times, or about $32,000 in today's money. But consider that Robert was not being paid wages comparable to those of a modern American. Perhaps this frustratingly large sum of money to purchase his wife's freedom was the motivation Smalls needed to take his life into his own hands. Now, as I'm sure most Americans are aware, the Civil War would begin soon after their marriage in 1861, and Smalls would be engaged in this struggle, being a crew member, possibly a deckhand, on a Confederate steamer named the CSS Planter, which operated out of the Charleston harbor. Perhaps it was now, when he finally found himself with access to a ship that he was comfortable with, that all of the events in his life came to a boiling point. His fear for his family's future, his upbringing, witnessing fellow enslaved people being punished and suffering in the fields, and maybe even the fact that he labored for so little in return, that he decided he would take the planter for himself and escape slavery at last. In the early hours of May 13, 1862, Smalls would make his escape. The night before, the white crew members of the ship left to sleep on shore, and upon this opportunity, Smalls and the other enslaved crew members would take this opportunity to take the ship and deliver it to the Union Navy, which was blockading Charleston Harbor as part of the blockade of all major southern ports. The plan was perilous, to say the least. To read a quote about the event, though the wharf and the U.S. fleet were only about 10 miles apart, Smalls would have to pass several heavily armed Confederate fortifications in the harbor, as well as multiple gun batteries along the shore without raising an alarm. The risk of discovery and capture was high. Because the planter created so much smoke and noise, Smalls knew that steaming past the forts and batteries undetected would be impossible. The ship had to appear to be on a routine mission under the command of its 3 white officers, who were always on board when it was underway. In the early hours of the morning, Smalls and the other crew members picked up their families, and Smalls would begin navigating out of the port. During this, he would navigate past 4 checkpoints disguised as the ship's white captain, while everyone else hid in the shadows below the deck. They would make it past the first 3 checkpoints in the harbor without issue, and that was when they'd reach the largest and most dangerous of them all, Fort Sumter, as in the Fort Sumter, the place where the Civil War began. Here, his crew would urge him to stay as far as possible from the fort, but Smalls refused, deciding not to change course, and instead giving the fort a signal, which after a few tense moments they would receive in return, acknowledging them and telling them to proceed. After this, they would approach the Union lines, which thankfully did not fire upon their ship. They would be boarded by Union soldiers, which Smalls saluted, and he would turn Planter over with its cannons and inform the Union Army of Charleston's defenses, which led to the capture of Coles Island just a week after his escape. Later that month, they passed a private bill authorizing the Navy to appraise the Planter and award Smalls and his crew half the proceeds for rescuing her from the enemies of the government. Of the $4,000 the vessel was appraised for, Smalls received $1,500 personally. Now, this was Smalls' best-known feat, escaping the Confederacy and handing the Union a Confederate steamer, but it was far from the end of his role or even this saga. After this, Smalls would travel to Washington and meet with President Abraham Lincoln himself, whom he helped to persuade to permit black men to serve for the Union Army. Soon after that meeting, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton would order 5,000 former slaves to fight for the Union, and Smalls served as a pilot on a number of naval vessels, operating in action against the Confederate forces there, including an ironclad which was sunk by enemy fire in April of 1863 during the attack on Fort Sumter. Smalls was injured during this event. Smalls, during the Civil War, would later be made captain of the Planter, becoming the first black man to be promoted to captain, although he was never a commissioned officer. In 1897, by an act of Congress, Smalls would be granted a pension equal to that of a Navy captain. After the war, poetically, Smalls would return back to Beaufort, South Carolina, and he would purchase the home of his former owner, Henry McGee, and would jump into a long career in state and national politics, becoming a leader for the residents of the Sea Islands during the Reconstruction era. In 1868, Smalls would be elected to the South Carolina House of Representatives, and later to the South Carolina Senate. There he helped to pass the state's 1868 Constitution and its provisions establishing statewide public schools and abolishing the parish system. During his tenure, he also sponsored laws forbidding racial discrimination in public accommodations, and became the leader of the state Republican Party. He was even promoted to Major General in the state's National Guard. In 1874, Smalls was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, where as a member of Congress, he fought against the disenfranchisement of black voters across the South. He represented South Carolina's 5th Congressional District from 1875 to 1879, and from 1882 to 1883. Smalls would also serve South Carolina's 7th Congressional District from 1884 to 1887. Also, during his time in Congress, he worked to make Parris Island Naval Station, which now trains thousands of brave men and women. He published a local newspaper and served as a customs collector in Beaufort. At the 1895 state constitutional conventions that deprived blacks the right to vote, he was one of the 6 black delegates that refused to sign in protest. In the face of the rise of Jim Crow, Smalls would also stand firm as an unyielding advocate for the political rights of African Americans, famously saying, "My race needs no special defense for the past history of them and this country. It proves them to be equal of any people anywhere. All they need is an equal chance in the battle of life." Ultimately, after having one hell of a life, Smalls would pass away on February 23rd of 1915 of malaria and diabetes in the same house where he had been born a slave. He's buried at Tabernacle Baptist Church in Beaufort. In January 2017, President Barack Obama issued an executive order establishing Reconstruction-era national monuments in Beaufort County, noting the significance of Robert Smalls to our national story. In 2019, the park was renamed Reconstruction-era National Historic Park. So there is a fascinating urban legend about the streets of Columbia, South Carolina, and why on earth the perimeter streets are so ridiculously wide. This story goes that the city planners back in the day had very specific motivations for these massive roadways, ones that are probably a little more myth than fact, but hey, it's an interesting tale. A bit of background: Columbia was established as the state's capital in 1786. Mostly because it was smack dab in the middle of South Carolina, closer to the state's interior than Charleston, and way less vulnerable to attacks from European naval forces in the Atlantic. Plus, it was conveniently located along a river, ideal for shipping goods. Politically, it was also a compromise. The elites essentially lived in Charleston, but the upstate folks were tired of being sidelined and wanted a bit more influence, so this upstate location gave them what they wanted as well. So here enters State Senator John Lewis Gervis, who said, "Let's build a city." He introduced a bill, and by 1786, a city grid was laid out on the land of John and Thomas Taylor's plantations, probably not where you'd want to put your welcome mat, but here we are, and the city was designed with 400 blocks, each sectioned into half-acre lots, and sold to land speculators and future residents. There was one catch: buyers had to build a house at least 30 feet long and 18 feet wide within 3 years, or they'd be fined. And boom, anyways, with all of this in mind, you've got yourself a grid system designed for future growth and fire prevention. But now let's dive into the real meat of this urban legend. If you've ever strolled through Columbia, you'll notice that the perimeter streets are an impressive 150 feet wide, which seems a bit excessive, right? And here's where the legend takes off. Some people claim the reason the streets are so wide is that they were trying to prevent mosquitoes from making their way into the city. The idea at the time was mosquitoes, being little creatures, couldn't fly more than 60 feet without dying of starvation. So if they just made the streets wide enough, they could stop those pesky little disease-carrying insects in their tracks. Now here's the thing. The myth is probably not true. It's based on some sketchy logic. See, back in the day, entomology wasn't quite the advanced science it is now. People didn't fully understand how insects functioned, and they thought mosquitoes had tiny energy reserves because they were small. Plus, mosquitoes tend to hang around stagnant water, like swamps, and early naturalists assumed that they wouldn't stray far from their breeding grounds. So, yeah, wide roads to prevent disease seems like a theory, but not a very good one. The truth, mosquito-borne diseases like yellow fever and malaria were still very much a problem in Columbia, despite the roads that were supposed to mosquito-proof the place. Admittedly, rates were lower than those in New Orleans and Charleston, but this was probably because Columbia's inland location was just a bit less mosquito-friendly. Rates of these diseases were still pretty bad in Columbia, so sorry to disappoint you, but it seems like the old urban planners might have missed the mark on this one, designing a city based on an urban legend and all. Maybe they should have just invested in some good bug repellent or long-sleeve clothing instead. Okay, so about 40 miles south of Charleston, there's something really weird. like distinctly weird. A place the government explicitly forbids you from visiting, yet is separated from other islands and the mainland by just a few thousand feet at some point. This place, of course, is Morgan Island, South Carolina, that is better known as Monkey Island. This 4,500-acre island is home to a colony of over 3,000 Indian rhesus monkeys, most of whom hang out on about 370 acres of the island. And fun fact, there's a sister colony of these monkeys on the Silver River in Florida, because apparently the US has a habit of just scattering loose primates across the landscape like a chaotic game of biological Monopoly, I guess. Now you may be wondering, how the heck did a bunch of monkeys end up in South Carolina? Well, the story starts in the Caribbean, at the Caribbean Primate Research Center in Puerto Rico. That facility originally housed this colony, but there was a slight issue. The monkeys kept escaping, carrying viral herpes B and infecting the local monkey populations. Understandably, Puerto Rico was not thrilled about this, and in response, between 1979 and 1980, 1,400 of these monkeys were relocated to Morgan Island. The island is now owned and managed by the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, while the monkeys themselves belong to the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases because they're used for public health research. Turns out the whole initiative started because the US needed a self-sustaining monkey breeding program after India decided, yeah, we're done exporting lab monkeys to you guys. So can you see these monkeys? Well, technically yes. You can take a boat tour or paddle offshore in a canoe or kayak and try to catch a glimpse of them. But if you set foot on the island, you're in deep trouble. Not only will the government come down on you for trespassing, but you also run the risk of getting herpes from a monkey, which honestly is all the downsides of a one-night stand with absolutely none of the upsides. So maybe just stick to sightseeing from the river. South Carolina, I had a heck of a time here with ya, and it was fun seeing a bunch of lore dating back to the Civil War era. Now, if you want more stories for your state or just more of this series in general, drop a comment below and let me know what you want to see next, and give me tips. I'd love to hear what you want me to cover. And hey, if you enjoyed the ride, hitting like and subscribing helps me get one step closer to my goal of 100,000 subs in 2025. Seriously, it's free, it's quick, and it lets YouTube know that this is the kind of content you'd like to see more of. As for what's next, I'm thinking New Jersey deserves a proper weird folklore video, so stay tuned for that. After that, I'm gonna do my darndest to get out a part 2 for Tennessee, or maybe the Smoky Mountains, and maybe another video for North Carolina folks too. And I'd also like to offer a little bit of love to Texas, Iowa, and Washington, so stay tuned for that. And remember, most importantly, whether you just saw a man sneaking into some tunnels near your house that had a strange feature in the middle of his forehead, or if you woke up in the middle of the night only to see a strange red creature hovering over you, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.